I don't know. Am I supposed to start? Okay. I wasn't sure. Hello. Good evening, everybody, and thanks for coming. I know it's not been easy today with the distractions of the weather and the obstacles of the strike, but I'm glad to see that so many of you have made it. My name is Simon Taylor. I'm an English, actually half English, now half Belgian, music journalist. Been living in Brussels for 30 years this year. And I'm a big music fan, concert goer, record buyer, streaming service addict, unfortunately. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity this evening to welcome Liz Pelly, who's written really a fantastic book. I'm going to be embarrassingly effusive for a Brit, but it's a really great book that I think is a place where Liz looks at everything that's happened in the world of streaming, going back to the effect of Napster and the file sharing service and the impact that it had in the, when was it, 2000, something like that?
1999 to 2000-ish.
I wasn't massively wrong. 2001. And then Spotify since its launch in 2006. Before we come on to the book and the subject of the book, just a few things. So that the way we're going to do this evening is I'm going to talk to Liz about the book for about half an hour, and then we have two guest speakers, Nick Yule and Josephine from KU Leuven, who are going to come on stage a little bit later on. Nick is from an organisation called IPO Artists, which represents performers or collecting societies on behalf of performers. And Josephine is a professor of intellectual property law, who's also just written her own book about contracts in the digital age, but we'll come on to that later. And then we will have time for an audience Q&A. We'll certainly reserve time at the end, but I may also invite questions as we go along. But that's the way this evening's going to go down. Coming back to the book, so let's maybe start with the title, Liz. I mean, the title is Mood Machine: The Rise of Spotify and the Cost of the Perfect Playlist. Tell us a little bit about the title. It's smart, I think. It sounds sort of retro dystopian, like a Clockwork Orange. Mood music is a good thing, but a mood machine, not so good.
Thank you. First I'll say thank you, Simon. Thanks, Joyce from AB, and to everyone else from the venue who helped put this together, to the co-panelists and everyone who's working, and thanks to all of you for being here. So when I first started writing about and researching Spotify and streaming, one of the first things that really interested me was the rise of the mood playlist in the streaming era. So, it was kind of overwhelming. I knew that I was interested in doing some reporting that started to dig into streaming in relation to how streaming was impacting listeners, right? So this was to be 2016, 2017. There was a lot of conversation at the time about royalties and how artists weren't getting paid very much from streaming. At this time, there had been this article that I think was really influential on the discourse around streaming by Damon Krakowski on Pitchfork called Making Sense, where he kind of laid out, the balance sheet of a band like Galaxy 500 that he was the drummer of. And I think this is a moment when the conversation really shifted around how are artists paid by streaming. But there wasn't as much conversation happening, from my perspective, at least in the world of music journalism. So I'm a music journalist. I know that there had been a lot of academic work that had been done and research that had existed on subjects like this, but journalists weren't really talking that much about how streaming was impacting listeners. So where to start, right? So I was like, okay, well, when you open Spotify today, this was 2016, what you see is, morning chill, like indie vibes, New Music Friday, these playlists. So digging into the mood playlist ecosystem, who controlled these playlists, what commercial deals were shaping what ended up on them, why are you being recommended, what you're being recommended, on whose dime, etc. This was really interesting to me. And then, when I think about the title, so the title comes from this article I did in 2019 called Big Mood Machine, where I was researching Spotify's kind of packaging and selling of mood data to data brokers and marketing companies. But the words together kind of evoked these two aspects of what I was interested in, which is how streaming has impacted the listener and how streaming has impacted artists. So I originally sort of conceptualized it on one hand, there's the way the rise of mood playlists has impacted streaming listeners, and then the word machine to me kind of evoked the material realities of musicians' lives and how artists are continuously squeezed by new types of enclosure and extraction in the platform era.
Yeah, just on the subject of playlists, playlists in themselves, they're not intrinsically evil or a bad thing. And particularly with streaming services where, you have something like, I saw a figure of 100 million tracks, you need something to help you navigate around all that content. It's somewhere someone called it the tyranny of choice. It is overwhelming. So, but what went wrong with playlists? How did they become the problem, or what did Spotify do wrong?
There's a chapter in the book called Selling Lean Back Listening. It's the third chapter of the book, and it's the chapter where I try to sort of chart the history of the concept of the streaming playlist. Because, when these services first emerged in the mid-2000s, streaming services were sort of more like search bars. You would have to know what you wanted to listen to, and it wasn't really until the, early 2010s. Spotify didn't get its first editorial staff until 2013, and when they acquired this company called Tunigo, and then 2014 was a year when they started making more investment into algorithmic personalization tech. But when I was charting the history of the playlist, I was thinking about, what is the historic precedent for the concept of a playlist? And you can think of it in relation to the commercial radio playlist. So, why do commercial radio playlists exist? And in some ways, they're sort of to control the experience of a radio listener, to kind of rein in, what DJs are able to play in comparison to maybe a more free-form or community radio station, where DJs have more kind of freedom to choose what they want to play. I think streaming services would have preferred that people think about playlists in relation to mixtapes, and I kind of sort of talk about playlists in relation to mixtapes. There was kind of this early Spotify ad where they had this kind of ad campaign around these two young people falling in love, about to have their first kiss, and it's the slogan is because mixtapes still work, and it's Spotify, and that made me, thinking about that was kind of interesting.
When was that? That was a long time ago.
That would have been 2015, I think.
They wouldn't try something like that now because they just get laughed out of.
Yeah. So I think any type of music curation, contextualizing, programming, it's always to ask questions of what is the goal? Who is this for? Why is music being programmed or contextualized in this way? And with streaming, it's, playlists emerged on Spotify as a way to grow their user base, reach new types of listeners. When they talked about the rise of the playlist, like in their marketing and like, advertising and media campaigns at the time. The rise of the Spotify playlist came at the same time as they launched this campaign called like Music for Every Moment. So it was really tailored to this time when they were trying to expand beyond enthusiasts and they were trying to reach like a more mass mainstream audience. And over time, I think we've seen these playlists kind of evolve to really just be kind of the tools that they use to boost user engagement. So it's kind of like elsewhere in the platform economy. There's like certain types of behavior, certain ideas that platforms incentivize or prioritize or promote in order to keep people engaged and boost data and boost, engagement metrics on the platform. And I think that's kind of like maybe what the difference is, is yes, there's, a whole history of technologies allowing music to be reordered and shared. But I think that the streaming playlist equally should be like understood in the context of all of the different, reasons why platforms collect data and then use that data to keep people hooked.
And that's one thing I found really interesting about the book. I mean, it's maybe many people here already knew it, but Daniel Ek himself, the founder, I mean, I think most people now feel he's not he's not someone dedicated to the health and of the music sector and the well-being of authors. But at the beginning, he Spotify was not designed or he's not committed to the music industry and let alone to musicians, and that's quite striking, I think.
Mm-hmm. I was really surprised to find out about his past as the chief technology officer for like a cartoon doll gaming company, because as a preteen I spent a lot of time playing with cartoon dolls, but that was his like part of his background. His background's in like advertising technology. Same thing, the co-founder Martin Lawrenson also comes from the world of advertising technology. And yeah, if you listen to, it was pretty interesting going back and finding early Martin Lawrenson media appearances where he talked about how we knew the revenue source was going to be ads because that's what my background was in, but we didn't know what the traffic source was going to be. Would it be video? Would it be music? Would it be product search? So that really stuck with me. I think, understanding that this was an advertising platform in search of a traffic source is pretty interesting. But that didn't, last long. There are these photos that you can find online of Daniel Ek like holding various guitars. It seems like over the years they've tried to specifically kind of like brand these people as like music guys, and it's interesting kind of just how easily debunked that is.
Yeah. There was an article in Harper's when I think not long after the book came out when you focused about that highlighted the ghost artists, these sort of fake content that Spotify and others are producing. So that's very indicative of the attitude of Spotify and the streaming services, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been interesting, like kind of watching that story sort of become so interesting to so many people. Like there definitely, I think, has been like a lot of like more like generalist readership interest in this phenomenon of ghost artists and Spotify's filling its playlists with fake artists, which is really interesting because I think in the music industry and amongst music journalists, like people have been talking about this for a long time, since 2016, 2017. But I think the reason why it connects with people is because it's just kind of such a revealing example of how diminished the role of the artist is or can be in these types of systems. Like the idea of Spotify filling its peaceful meditation playlist with stock music that they get from these production companies that commission musicians in bulk, in mass to make these tracks. Like, I had the opportunity to interview a bunch of musicians who have worked with these production companies that service this music to Spotify and end up on these playlists. And a lot of them, tell me stories of kind of like cranking out a dozen tracks at a time under one-off monikers. Or refer to it as their like Spotify playlist gig that they have on the side to just sort of like make a few extra dollars. And yeah, it's like, the idea of a Spotify user like searching for some peaceful meditation music and getting this playlist filled completely with like production music or stock music kind of just speaks to how when you have a system where people are being incentivized to just like not seek out artists and albums, but just click like lo-fi beats, like chill dinner playlist, like bossa nova dinner or whatever it is that they encourage people to listen to. It really diminishes the role of artists.
Yeah, I think for me there's a very depressing chapter in the book, which is the one about social media, in particular about TikTok, which. And the way that because of the length of the music clips used is so short. I mean, it just seems like I'm not on TikTok. My children didn't want me to be on TikTok. I think that's still the case now. But it just seems like it really seems like a hellscape to me. But fortunately, at the end of the book, you have a much more positive picture of lots of initiatives, and a way of sort of having a healthier ecosystem for musicians and what they can do. I just noted some of the things, Dan. You said in the intro, what makes culture less interesting for listeners is what makes it less sustainable for artists. And you talk a lot in the book about how the Spotify model of the creator is a sort of micro-entrepreneur, but you say that the opposite is also true. Working collectively to improve material conditions for musicians benefits all of us who love listening to music too. That's where there's power and possibility. What do you think? I think it's great that the message, that the book, the closing chapter of the book sort of has that positive message, and you go into quite a lot of detail about some of the projects that are, I think, fighting back against the domination of the streaming services, but also of the majors, because of course, and we're going to talk about the sort of the structure of the business and the concentration and business a bit more with our next speakers. But there are lots of projects that give grounds for some optimism, I think. What would you particularly highlight, or what's your kind of what's your vision of a sort of healthier music ecosystem that treats creators with the respect and allows them to sort of earn a living as they deserve?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one thing that I write a lot about towards the end of the book, and the last two chapters that are about sort of this alternate way of thinking about not just Spotify, but culture in general, right? So this is a book that is about Spotify, but I also think that it's just a book that's about, what happens when we allow corporations to have too much influence over culture or over our lives. So the ending chapters of the book are really specifically, not about trying to say like, well, if you get this app instead of this app, then like click here to solve everything, like that obviously would be way too simplistic. I think imagining a future for music beyond what we currently have now in the streaming status quo involves this sort of big picture reckoning with music labor, or the relationship between creative labor and capitalism, the music business more broadly. So I have a chapter towards the end of the book, chapter 18, that's called The New Music Labor Movement, and it is specifically focused on telling the story of this independent musician solidarity organization that emerged in 2020 in the U.S. called, the Union of Musicians and Allied Workers. And they, over the years, have done like a few different campaigns around streaming. One was called Justice at Spotify, and I don't know if they organized a protest in Belgium, but I know there were protests like all around the world on this one day, where they like delivered a list of, a vision for how Spotify could be more fair to musicians, and they delivered these letters and envelopes to the front desk of Spotify offices all around the world. But I also tell the story of this bill that they wrote together with, in the United States, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. I don't know if you guys know who that is or not.
She's of Palestinian origin, I think, isn't she?
Mm-hmm.
Is that her? Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they worked together on this bill called the Living Wage for Musicians Act that would create a new type of revenue stream that would go directly from the streaming services to the performing artists. So I think just the general idea of a group like that, like there being these sort of solidarity organizations, like musicians sort of having a collective voice, both in terms of like how to fix streaming, like, or create alternatives altogether is an important first step. Like, I don't think that anything will change unless musicians are organized, especially independent musicians. And then towards the end of the book, in the conclusion, one group that I talk about, actually, like for a pretty lengthy part of the conclusion, is this cooperative of musicians based largely in Chicago. These like avant-garde free jazz musicians, 30 of them, who like came together to build their own cooperatively run music streaming service that is kind of like Patreon, but rather than paying royalties, they just like split the fee amongst the 30 musicians every month. And to me, it presented a really interesting example of a group of musicians coming together to build digital infrastructure that works for them. They sort of moves away from the per stream valuation of music. And I spend all this time painting this example, not because I'm like, everyone should go subscribe to their platform, but because I think it's replicable and it shows a model of what other communities and scenes, could build. It's not like a very technologically advanced streaming platform by any means. It's browser-based. It's like a pretty simple thing. It's called Catalytic Sound. So like Catalytic Sound, and then a bunch of writing that I do about public libraries in the United States and Canada that have launched local music streaming services. They both sort of, to me, illustrate that when you are talking about technology or criticizing technology or streaming, like it is barely ever about the technology itself, and is more often than not about the way that industry practices and power and economics and politics inform those technologies. So, it raises this question for me, like, is the problem with streaming the idea of a bunch of music being stored on a central server and people listening to it through the internet rather than having all the files on their computer? Maybe not. I mean, we talked a lot backstage about like the sort of value and meaning that comes with collecting music and having your own library. And I do think that it lends itself to a deeper relationship with the music that you listen to. But I also think that these sort of musician-run, cooperative, public-funded library streaming visions of what streaming could look like do kind of like represent something that I think could be healthier for culture.
Okay, and how are those projects going to fare in the Trump era? Are they things that can carry on, will not be affected? And behind that question is I'm thinking about the FTC and is not going to sort of intervene in any major way, presumably to help restore the balance. I mean, you talk a lot in the book about the bill, but I'm not. Was the bill approved and did it become law or?
The bill is not approved. It is not law, but from what I understand, it's going to be reintroduced at some point in the next year. I do in the book, yeah, it's just kind of like depressing, but in the book I do talk a bit about like different things that specifically in the United States the Federal Trade Commission like could do to intervene on streaming. Specifically, like in the United States there's this like one specific part of our FTC law that like potentially could allow that entity to require some more like transparency around the contracts between major labels and streaming services. They could create new laws around digital payola. When I was writing the book, that seemed really possible. It was mostly like 2023. There was a head of the FTC under the last administration that seemed like this would potentially be something that would have been interesting to her. But yeah, I think in terms of like FTC intervention, current perspective is like check back in 4 years.
yeah, unfortunately. Okay, good. Just one final question, and then I think we'll invite Nick and Josephine to join us. But when you were researching the book, what was the thing that kind of upset you the most? There's a lot of very negative things, and if I think about my own relationship with Spotify, I look back to see when I subscribed, and then I cancelled my subscription when they did the contract with Joe Rogan, not for any ethical reason, although I wasn't very happy, but it was because Joni Mitchell and Neil Young took their content off Spotify, and I can't live without Joni Mitchell.
If you can't get Joni, there's no reason.
No, exactly, and she's back on now though. So, but I feel my personal relationship with Spotify was kind of like, it's like finding out your uncle is a kind of is like a kind of a pest or something. It's kind of at the beginning, you think you've got this great product, and then over time you realize that the guy that's running it is a creep, and he's investing in AI battlefield technology, and he doesn't really care about musicians, and then he says musicians should be grateful and they should produce more content so that I get even richer. And so what was... I don't know, maybe we shouldn't focus on what the most depressing thing was, but what was for you the most depressing thing?
Yeah. There were like many moments of sadness.
I thought you might say that.
I think that, it's interesting. I was just thinking about this earlier today, actually. I think that for me, the thing that evoked the most like deep sadness was just spending... to write this book, I had to spend a lot of time immersed sort of in like the literature and mindset of the corporate music business, and immersed sort of in a way of thinking of art that really, really aggressively imposes a sense of scarcity onto music. And as someone with a background in DIY and punk, like I think that so much of what drives people to be involved in like grassroots music scenes is fighting that, trying to encourage the idea that anyone can make music, trying to make the ability to learn an instrument and join a band as accessible as possible. Obviously, like DIY scenes have all sorts of problems that we always have to like grapple with too. But the idea is like that, music isn't this like scarce thing that only like a select group of geniuses can make. It's like anyone who is interested in learning how to play an instrument and write some songs like could, do it because it's a fun thing to do with your friends, and anyone who's interested in making music like should do it. So it's like, having to spend a lot of time immersed in the like polar opposite viewpoint was kind of grating.
And the other one interesting thing in the book is you say that actually now one of the reasons why the Swedish music scene has been so successful with like Max Martin, right? I mean, not that this is the be all and end all, but one of the reasons for the strength of the Swedish music scene was because there was a lot of free musical education for people, and that's now under threat from the right-wing government. So,
it was really interesting. I went to Sweden twice to work on this book, and one of the times that I was there, I was interviewing people about Spotify, but way more people people were way more interested in talking to me about all of these governmental cuts that had been made to like adult education music programs that were such an important part of how Sweden kind of, got the music scene that it has. And a lot of the thinking was like, oh, these people are just amateurs. Why should we fund their hobbies? And it seemed to really echo a lot of stuff that I was hearing in the music industry at the time about this kind of like, fight against amateurism, which if you really care about making music accessible, like those are also like, it's also a part of the music landscape that is important to kind of like, bolster, not try to stamp out.
Okay, thanks. I tell you what, I'm going to take, as Liz is here on her own, before we invite the other speakers on stage, does anyone have any questions directly to Liz now before we have a broader debate? Are you a bit nervous? Oh. Sorry, Joyce, I didn't prepare you for that. I didn't warn you, but I'll make so. I tell you what, it's being recorded, so I think the recording engineer would thank me. Steph is a very nice guy. We spoke earlier. I can't see him. I think he's in a booth somewhere. But anyway, do you want to maybe? I mean, I don't want to compromise your personal privacy, but maybe say where you're from or what your interest is, maybe. You don't have to, actually, but I don't know. I like it. I don't know. Whether you're a musician or I don't know, or whatever.
Hi, my name is Pamela. I work in music media. I'm interested in music. I wanted to ask you a question about the TikTok conversation that was had, because we talked about how TikTok is also like a hellscape, and there's also a world where we create music as a scarcity, but I also feel like platforms like TikTok have also propelled a lot of careers for people who would never have had the opportunity to make it through traditional means because of other barriers you might face, like gender or race, anything like that. So I was wondering how you feel about that balance between social media and the way we consume music, and also the influence of Spotify with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, for certain types of musicians, like music is so vast. There's lots of different reasons why people make music. There's lots of different reasons why people consume music. And for certain types of artists, Spotify's been great. Like TikTok's been great. I think that my concern is more with like the types of artists that I feel like are left behind by these platforms. But, that's not to say that there aren't some people who benefit. I think there's a really specific thing with like TikTok as it relates to independent music, where I feel like there's like a specific vision of like the independent musician who can be successful through TikTok, which is this idea of like the solo creative entrepreneur. And I do like worry about the extent to which that gets kind of like wrapped up in all the trappings of like hustle culture and the idea of like musicians as influencers and kind of, this kind of like staunch individualism that can come with it. So, that's not to say that there's something inherently like wrong about that model, but I do, also think we should be concerned with the type of pressures that musicians who are even, benefiting from TikTok or platforms like it feel, like something I've heard from, because I teach undergraduates, so I work with a lot of young people who, are making music that they're hoping will go viral on TikTok or something like that, and I worry about like the types of pressures they feel to like write a certain type of music, like act a certain type of way, present themselves in a certain type of way. They're also similarly the way that some musicians and like what I refer to as the peak playlist era in my book, where editorial playlists were kind of like, a former employee describes it, that there was a period of time where editorial playlists were the top of the discovery funnel in the music business, and at a certain point, the top of the discovery funnel shifted to TikTok. And in both realities, like I think there are a lot of platform pressures that artists are feeling to kind of like present a certain way, write songs a certain way, and yeah, specifically what you were mentioning with TikTok is in my book, I talk about how, there's kind of dynamic that plays out where artists are like writing hooks and then like putting them on TikTok, and then if the hooks go viral, then they'll finish writing that song, and if the hook doesn't go viral, then they just scrap that song, and like that has a lot of implications for what making music even is, but yeah, it's definitely not like there's not exceptions.
Okay, thank you.
We have a question in the back row, and then just here.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Glad to see you here. I'm a student and who is interested in generally personalization algorithms and like automated decision makings on these platforms. And I was wondering, you talk about several playlists, like personalized playlists featured by Spotify, and I've also seen a lot of discussions about how it's influencing the people experience music and sonic experience in general. And I was wondering, do you have empirical insights into how it is actually affecting the people? What is the majority, is minority? Do you have some empirical evidences on that?
Like in terms of the percentage of music that gets discovered through personalization algorithms?
Yeah, sort of.
Yeah, so my main research methodology is interviewing people because I'm a journalist. So I didn't do any kind of I didn't gather any large data sets or anything like that for this book. In terms of how many people listen to these playlists, in a lot of ways, it's sort of like presenting the statistics and information that the platform puts forward, and sort of acknowledging that a lot of times these platforms are overhyping their capabilities, presenting statistics that make them look good to investors, and then trying to look at those numbers and say, okay, this is their aspiration, or this is how they wish to present, and what does that mean? So I think in the book I cite, when Spotify went public on the stock exchange, they said that a third of the music that gets consumed on their platform is music that people are consuming because of a playlist recommendation. And that would probably be the closest that I have to a specific statistic about playlist consumption.
We had one more question here. I'm going to take this last question, then we'll bring the other speakers on, and we'll have more questions later on as well. So it's not. Actually, it was.
Sorry. Okay.
Yeah. Here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here today. I work a lot with podcasters in different EU countries. And actually, I know you wrote a book about the music, but we've seen recently the professionalization of podcasts, so podcasters being invited to actually record, not independently, but in Spotify studios. We've seen the exclusive content behind the paywall, and also we've seen the audiobooks coming to Spotify. I was wondering whether in your research you have already touched upon the future of Spotify and what else they will try to sell us. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that the investment in podcasts and audiobooks certainly shows that kind of maybe it's interesting to consider in the context of what the point that is made in the book about how when Spotify started, it wasn't necessarily that they really wanted to make a music app, but that music was almost kind of more incidental to what they thought would be the easiest to start with. And in some ways, it's sort of maybe it's coming full circle to it seems like Daniel Ek specifically always had some interest in video. There had been attempts over the years to, beyond even that initial first era of the company. But there's another book about Spotify called The Spotify Play that was written by Swedish newspaper journalists a few years ago. And there's like some more chapters in that book about their, over the years, like kind of failed attempts to make a really strong go at video on the platform as well, and some partnerships that they had with different companies making video content that kind of fell apart. So it definitely like seems like there's long been interest in expanding beyond music. The book definitely like is a book that's about music, but something that I think I've often tried to put forward. In 2020, I think it was, or 2021, I wrote an article about Spotify. It must have been 2019 because it was around when Spotify first started like aggressively getting into podcasting and making all these major investments and bringing all of these podcasters exclusively onto the platform. And the kind of point of the article was, there's a phrase that is like such a cliche of writing around the subject, but for a really long time, people in the music business have argued that musicians are sort of like the canaries in the coal mine, and like what happens to musicians is a sign of, what may be happening in other corners of media and society in years to come. And I think that the article that I did about, it was called Podcast Overlords, is in the Baffler. It was about Spotify's podcast strategy. Part of the point of it was sort of trying to put forth like people in the media should really take musicians' experiences with this platform seriously. Like for a decade at that point, musicians had been sort of trying to point out all of the negative consequences of streaming on their industry and their livelihoods. And it was sort of this moment of like, why aren't people in the books industry and the media industry more broadly like taking these concerns seriously? And I'm still not sure if I have answer to that question.
Just one thing, when you if I can abuse my position as just to ask one question, a lot of the book you quote internal Slack conversations from Spotify. Did you have a deep throat at Spotify, or how the hell did you get access to so much great internal discussions about what was going on? You're looking embarrassed, so I feel you probably don't want to tell me about that.
I'm not going to answer that question.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
all right. Okay, well, I think you kind of answered the question by not answering the question, but I was very impressed by the references to Slack. And is it kind of our revenge on Slack in a way? It'd be nice to think that we could somehow get our revenge on these systems of control and surveillance. But anyway, maybe not. Okay. Right. At this point, I'd like to invite our there's a nice French word. Is it a French word? Discussant. The other speakers this evening, Nick and Josephine. I can't see you. Oh, you're in the front row. That's why I can't see you. Nick, Josephine, come on, and I'll quickly introduce you. I tried a little bit before. Josephine van Harp. I'm sure I massacred that. Josephine van Harp. Better? No? Stop. I'm digging a hole now, aren't I?
I'm afraid so, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Is a professor, lecturer of Professor of IT law.
IP law.
IP law,
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah,
IT
intellectual
law.
property
Intellectual
law.
property law from KU Leuven. I don't think I need to explain what KU Leuven is. Nikhil is head of legal at IPO Artist, which represents performers' organisations, or the collecting societies working on behalf of
Close enough.
Thank you, Nick.
Representing the interests of performers. That's what I would say.
All right. Okay, great. So now we can have the really interesting part of the discussion. I'm being ironic, or trying to be, in case someone is not, in case my British irony isn't clear enough, is to talk about the business and the IP side of the industry, of the music industry, and what's happened with streaming. So let me start maybe by asking a very basic question: is the problem just that the industry is dominated by the majors? and that they've got into bed, or Spotify and the streaming services have done deals with the three big majors. I looked at some figures. The three majors, UMG, Sony, and Warner, thank you, have 70% of the recorded music business. And Spotify has done deals with them. And I think it's a quote from your report that says, instead of democratizing the music industry, streaming, a Freudian slip, streaming appears to have led to a replication of traditional music industry dynamics. Josephina, do you want to?
Yes, indeed.
That is your quote.
That is a quote from my book, actually, which was also published in the beginning of this year, which is a publication of my PhD research on the music industry, on contracts in the music industry, and how the law affects those situations, and how the law tries to make the world a better place by, leveling the playing field.
What was the title of the book? Because
it's called Music Contracts in the Streaming Age, Law and Policy in the European Union and the United Kingdom. It's a super long title, but I hope the contents are interesting.
And that's the one with the chapter that we were talking about?
Yes, indeed. Yes. And one of the sentences in that book is, again, about the replication of traditional industry dynamics. And that is true. These traditional industry dynamics have worked in favor of the bigger players, which is traditionally the case with technological developments and has also been the case in the music industry. But is it the only problem? I wouldn't say so. It's an evolution that has taken place over the past few decades. Things have been a certain way in the past, and because of the power of vested interests, these vested interests have been able to continue such money-consuming activities without being limited by the law to a significant extent. So there is indeed this dominance on the part of three big players. And there used to be like five. And then little by little, as is the case in the book publishing industry, little by little, they got eaten by each other. And now there's three big players. And that indeed is a big factor in why the music industry is shaped the way that it is at the moment.
Yeah. Okay, Nick?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that Spotify's not really very much different from any of the other ones. If we all stopped subscribing to Spotify and switched to Apple, it would make zero difference. It would make a few pennies difference. So Spotify isn't themselves the bad guys. It's the combination of Spotify with predominantly the major record labels. Because while this discussion has been going on, the record labels have generated $2 million in this past hour. $2 million. That's the amount that they've made in an hour. So the problem is that the money is there. Liz talks about it in her book that Spotify generates royalties. So they make a lot of money, and they do produce a lot of money. But the question is, where does that money go? And we've seen that for various reasons, a lot of it goes into the value of the company, the shares, and that's why we see that the head of Spotify, Daniel Ek, he has cashed in shares worth €500 million in the past couple of years. So that's where some of the money goes. But more importantly, what I would like to touch on with what Josephine said, the money comes down from Spotify, and it doesn't go to the artists. It goes to the record labels. And once it's in the record labels, does it get to the artists? And that's what Josephine touches on in her book. And the fact is that it just doesn't. And there are various reasons for that. I'd love to talk about the record industry contracts, but we probably don't have time. But what the solution that some people, and this is, I mention it because it's happening in Belgium, something that is a solution, arguably, is for money from Spotify to go directly to the artists. So some of the money goes to the labels do what they want with it, they pass it around. What they don't do is they never give it to the session musicians. So not one single session musician ever receives a penny from any money generated on any streaming platform. So what a proposal that's happening in Belgium, and it exists in many countries, is that a percentage of the money that Spotify makes and all the other DSPs goes straight to the artists, bypassing the contracts. So that's one way of making it a fairer, more sustainable economy. There are many others.
Maybe we should talk about percentages as well, like the way things are distributed now. We pay 100%. Spotify keeps 30%, so that leaves 70% that then goes to everybody in the music industry, and then a lot of divisions are being made. So on the one hand, there's a division between composition and sound recording. There's a division between different songs in the music industry, obviously, on the basis of what we listen to, what has been played. And then there's a division being made between like the corporate partners, which is music publishers and record companies, but also a wealth of other intermediaries, like distributors, aggregators, and so forth, and all different players that play a certain role. They take a certain percentage depending on the amount of things they do for the music, and then ultimately at the end part of it goes to the musicians, both performing and composing, who then have to pay their manager, their lawyer, very important, and also taxes, right? So that's basically the end of the line. And for musicians, there's about, if I remember correctly, 13 to 20%, something like that, and that is still where they have to pay all of their people from. So that's, at the end of the line, what stays is really not that much.
It also depends on the age of the contract, because
definitely,
I mean, if you're an older on an old contract, you're receiving like about maybe something like 8% royalties. So the record label keeps 92, they give 8 to the artist. Even like a band like Radiohead were getting 13%. I mean, it might have been 16, but about 13% on one of their, I think it was their second album. So even if you're a really big band, you're still going to get screwed by the label.
I would like to nuance that slightly, and there are some contracts where the situation for the musicians is much better, right? There are absolutely horrendous situations, and there have been for a very long time. However, things that are negotiated now, there the royalty rate for musicians is significantly higher, just so we have that clear.
Sorry, Liz, did you want to come in?
Oh, no, yeah, and just, you know, in the world of independent music, the sort of like rock solid foundation is a 50-50 split with the artist after expenses, which I also think offers like a really interesting juxtaposition with this 92.8.
And maybe interesting to note that currently in the Netherlands, there's a case ongoing whereby a few artists have sued the major record labels to obtain such a 50-50 division. And in that proceedings, I've been told that my work has been submitted as evidence. So we'll see.
Oh.
We'll see.
Nice.
To sort of ask the question that I asked to Liz about what the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. Federal Trade Commission?
The European Commission, yes.
No. In the US, the Federal Trade Commission, which, in case, for those of you who are not competition law students or anything like that, is basically responsible for trying to ensure fair competition in markets. What's going on in the EU? Is the European Commission doing anything to look at some of these issues? Is there any legislation underway that could improve the revenue sharing for artists?
So on the one hand, indeed, competition law. You say the word competition law, and my face lights up. Yes,
I thought
I'm a nerd.
I thought that might happen.
So
we're in Brussels, so I mean, you know.
That is true. Specifically in the context of competition law, something is indeed ongoing. Like a year ago, news broke that Universal Music was going to purchase Downtown Music, a very important player in the independent sector. And a few days ago, news broke that the European Commission is going to investigate that. So work is ongoing in that context.
So I know about this for various reasons, but I didn't know, I'd never heard of Downtown. So maybe it's worth explaining what Downtown is and does and why it's so important.
Maybe that's more. No, you go for it. So Downtown Music Publishing is a specific independent player who has been playing an important role in setting up a more direct link between musicians and their audience, which is something that I think we could all get behind. If you have the direct link with the audience and you don't need to go through another intermediary, then that's very good news. They have very good tech as well in terms of finding out where certain plays come from and how many plays there have been. So this data, obviously, in 2025 is really, really important. They had developed this algorithm that would allow musicians to have more of this information. And obviously, if this tech is in the hands of the biggest music company in the world, well, often that could lead to bad news.
And of course, it follows the fact that Universal acquiring PIS, one of the biggest independents, and which
yes, you're almost around the corner.
Exactly,
here.
exactly. But which also removed a major independent and also a very important distributor. That's the really important thing in the sector, isn't it? That PIS was a distributor for a lot of independents.
It goes to show that this evolution of the bigger players becoming bigger and the smaller players even maybe being removed from the landscape entirely is a thing that is ongoing, and it's an ongoing evolution. So I do feel it's a good idea for the European Commission to act now, even if it's maybe a bit too late, because when EMI got sold off to Sony, to Universal, things were accepted quite easily. And also, a few years ago, there was this big competition law inquiry in the United Kingdom. And then there was a huge study on the economics of music streaming. And then the UK competition law authority said, no, there's no problem. Well, no, there are certain difficulties that are inherent in the streaming industry that are not the place of competition law to act upon. So UK,
yeah, kind of.
It's a 300-page report, it's a difficult.
It's two. I've read them, but it's actually really interesting because you're the competition law expert, right? And I'm not. I know those reports really, really well, and it's really, really frustrating because where did they get the evidence from? They got it from the record labels, and they got it from the streaming platforms. It's just bullshit. Oh, this has been recorded. Sorry, and so that's really, really frustrating. And also, again, I'm not a competition expert, but the reason that they said there wasn't a competition problem in the UK was not because the music industry was great. They said there was no competition law problem because the consumers were having a great time. And of course they were. There's not a competition problem. If you can get all the music in the world for £10, and you can get it from however many different platforms you want, of course there's not a problem. So that's what they said. And so regardless of what the legal definition of competition problems are, what happened in the UK, a statistic from that was that 98% of the top 1,000 UK singles in 2021 were either on a major record label or with a major publisher. So if you want to have a commercial, successful record, it's only possible if you're signed to a major record label. That's what that showed. So yeah, competition, that's one thing. But you asked what's going on, what else can help? There was a law that came into force in 2019 in Europe, and it's got some really great provisions on it. It's got one about transparency, and it says that record labels have to give their artists transparent information on all revenue generated, so right down to the T-shirts sold and all that kind of stuff. And the record labels are not happy about that. The other thing it's got is something called...
But are they doing it? Are they complying? Because they have to? Or?
No.
Ah, they're not.
No.
Okay.
But no, they're not. We did a study. It's called Streams and Dreams 2. And it showed, I don't remember the exact percentages, but basically these new laws that were introduced are not being complied with. One of them, for example, is called contract adjustment. So if your contract, basically if it's not fair, and there's various reasons it might not be fair, you can ask the label to adjust it and get a higher royalty, basically. And the study that we did showed that it only works in about 5% of cases. It says you can get your rights back if the labels aren't exploiting them. That only works in about 4% of cases. So it's one thing having laws, it's another thing putting them into practice. The European Commission is supposed to be checking them at the moment. I really hope they actually do their job and really check the details and not just tick boxes and see whether it's been written down on a bit of paper in each European country.
I mean, I don't think anyone else is going to stick up for the record company, so I'm going to play devil's advocate. I mean, the period that Liz's book looks at, I mean, it starts with the rise of Napster or the when Napster sort of went big. I mean, music industry revenue has gone down significantly since then. and And the average price of a subscription to a streaming service has gone down because there are more student discounts, family discounts. You know, the cost of your subscription hasn't gone up. So...
Hang on, mine has. Am I doing something wrong?
Belgium just changed.
In Belgium it has, okay. But I mean, okay, but the average price, I mean, aren't the companies entitled to try and recoup some of the ground that they've lost?
I have to jump in here. Having said that the major record labels generate 2 million euros in an hour, I don't really care whether they're making more now than they made in the CD era. They are making ridiculous amounts of money. The head of Universal takes home something like 250 million a year. So the record labels are making insane amounts of money. And that's fine. They're allowed to make money. But the issue is if we have an economy, a streaming economy that's going to be fair economically and fair in terms of what Liz is talking about in her book, you can't have a fair streaming market that's good for society if all the money is going to one part of the business. And what I love about Liz's book is that she doesn't just focus on the financial side, and she talks about how streaming, how it impacts on society and the way we consume music. But if we continue to have a system whereby 3 major record labels are making such insane amounts of money, then we're not going to have a system whereby independent artists are going to have a chance to thrive. And then if we don't have the independent artists that have a chance to thrive, we're in this feedback loop of getting the same artists over and over again. And that's what the algorithms do, that's what playlisting does, and that's what I think is in Liz's book, basically.
Liz? We've talked a lot about the EU and the Commission and competition law and Article 122 and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. But do you want to bring us back to the human impact?
Oh, well, I think it's just can be useful sometimes to just kind of step back and look at the music business and remember that it's a system of capital accumulation and is a system of various industry players who make decisions based on how to insulate and protect their capital. And it's not the same as thinking about what would be helpful for artists or what would be helpful for listeners, whether we're talking about fair compensation or more sustainable compensation for musicians, or talking about things like data privacy and the ability to listen to music without having your data extracted and sold to marketing companies and data brokers.
Maybe there's a part that we haven't touched upon yet in detail, which is the Digital Services Act at the European Union level, which is again about regulation and again about the EU level, but it may be interesting for the playlists as well in terms of transparency requirements, right? So the Digital Services Act entered into force February 2024. Does a lot of things, one of them being introducing transparency requirements in recommender systems by very large online platforms. That's the official term. It's abbreviated officially as VLOPs. I kid you not. People are talking about.
Flemish, no? Oh, it sounds
it's
Flemish.
It's really not though. It's really the official term. It's called VLOP, very large online platforms, and those very large online platforms, such as Spotify, such as TikTok, that came into the picture before, they are required by law to give a certain amount of transparency on the recommender algorithms that are used, for example, in automated playlists. So in principle, in theory, obviously theory and practice are always far from each other, as was illustrated before with the DSM directive provisions, which are really not that much applied in practice. But it's the same here. In theory, Spotify should give information to users about how playlists are being formed. And if you look at the terms and conditions now, they just say, well, our playlists may be influenced by commercial considerations, which in practice means that if you're a musician and you say, okay, I buy into discovery mode, I will accept that if people then listen to my music via the algorithm, I will get paid less money per stream. And I find that quite distasteful, to be honest. It's the same when you go to your front page and you listen to a lot of music, and then your favorite artist has a new CD coming out, and there's like a big box on your front page that says, new CD coming out now. Don't click it. Because if you click that, the artist gets paid less than if you search for it through the search bar. So there's a few things that are built into Spotify that obviously are there for commercial considerations, and you can't blame a company for being a company, right? You can, however, try to work around their commercial incentives and try to think further than that.
Do you want to maybe say something about the pro rata model? Because it's very complicated. When I was reading up,
it is.
But I don't know if everyone knows about the pro rata model for assigning revenue on streaming services, and I don't know. I'm sure you understand it, but it's complicated.
Can I make a suggestion to either of those two that rather than explaining pro rata, which is unbelievably complicated, sorry to take over your job, but if you explain user centric, because that's a lot easier.
I was going to say that, Nick. Or maybe you can also talk about alternative systems like user centric. There you go. But thank you.
I think the main important things to know are that streaming services, like you mentioned earlier, don't pay artists directly. They pay rights holders, so they pay the record labels or that represent artists or whoever holds the contract of the service, and they don't pay per stream. They pay based on this really complicated revenue share model. So if you're Universal Music Group and your catalog had 20% of all the streams on Spotify during a royalty period, then you would get a piece of the eligible royalty pool, 20% of your eligible royalty pool per the terms of your contract, and then the label gets their percentage of the pro rata pie and then pays artists based on the contracts that they have with the artists. So there's all these different levels of abstraction to it from my perspective, like for artists, but user-centric is this proposed model where instead of this complicated revenue share model, if you pay $10 for a streaming service, they keep their 30% platform fee and fees for taxes or whatever, then the remaining 70% would go to the artists you listen to. So,
which is what doesn't happen with the pro rata model, basically.
Right.
Maybe to make that concrete with an example, if everybody in the world listens only to Taylor Swift, and you listen to heavy metal, and you really, really love it, and 100% of your Spotify time goes to heavy metal, still, most of your subscription fee will go to Taylor Swift. Because all of the streams are put in one pot, and then the percentage is...
Quite rightly, some people might say, but no.
I adore Taylor Swift,
Sorry.
So I don't mind at all.
I think Taylor Swift currently gets around 2% of all streams on Spotify, so I would gather that it's probably around, no matter what you listen to, that your 2% of your streaming revenue subscription is going to Taylor Swift.
And then with user-centric, your money goes to your people.
And that's and is it SoundCloud has a user-centric model? Is that right?
SoundCloud, yes, and then Deezer really wants it, but finds it difficult to put it into practice.
Because
of contracts. Yes. And the big labels are not in favor of user-centric. Because that would imply a diversion of revenue away from bigger artists to niche artists, such as jazz artists, more local artists singing in local languages. And many of those are not attached to a major label. So agreeing with user-centric would imply less money for major labels. Not entirely sure, but economic studies have been going into that direction. And that user-centric would be good for niche and bad for English American pop in general.
And one other thing on that, which is incredible, I think, is that when at the end of the month there's some money left over that can't be attributed because they don't know who it goes to and they can't find the person, what they do is they just chuck it back into the royalty pool, and it's divided up amongst the people they can identify. So if Taylor Swift has got 2% of all of the streams, then she gets 2% of all of this unallocated money that the most of it is going to bands that you haven't heard of. It's easy to find Taylor Swift. It's not easy to find the last guy that played in this club, you know. So it's a model that benefits the major labels.
And then again, in terms of percentages, there's not really a consensus of how much that unallocated money is, but numbers go well up into the double digits. Right? So it could be, it's likely a very, very fair amount of money.
In your writing on this, Josephine, you set out why all these other models would be better for diversity, for niche music types and stuff, and then you immediately say why it's unlikely to happen because of the vested interest. So maybe what other model? So maybe we can't. The obstacles to fixing the royalty system for streaming are just too great. So maybe we need to look at other ways of supporting musicians and the music-making community. And Nick, that's a cue to you to talk about some of the things that you advocate. No? We practice this.
Yeah,
I mean, well, I'm thinking of sort of other forms of income support that are
going to gigs and that kind of thing.
Well, going to gigs, but all, you know, we were talking before about this place, about Ancienne, Belgique, where there's in a lot of European countries where there's direct support to artists, to cultural institutions. I was actually thinking of the different. You know, the experiment in Ireland with a sort of special income for, you know, maybe it's a combination of some of those kind of initiatives that, and not that I think anyone wants Spotify and the majors to be allowed to get away with what they've been doing and to get even worse, because we know that they will get worse because unconstrained businesses, that's what they do. But maybe the solution, you know, needs a variety of approaches.
Yeah, I mean,
because the problem is the pauperization of musicians, the marginalization of musicians, the challenge of diversity, and genuine choice, and the future of community-based music making as well. Because the other thing that's very strong in the book is like. The majors and the streaming services, they like the atomized creator, you know, who's doing everything, doing the marketing on TikTok. But that individual has so little negotiating power against the big companies.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a role for government to play, and government can fund venues like this. It can, you know, give direct financial support to artists. But when the government funds it, it basically means that you guys are funding it, all taxpayers are funding it. And if you're not a music fan, you don't really necessarily want your money going to musicians. So one thing they did in France was the government imposed a levy on the streaming platforms, so that they had to pay something like 1.4% of their revenue. So Spotify and all the other ones, 1.4% of their money goes to a French cultural Conseil de Musique Nationale, something. And they then distribute it, they use it for various cultural purposes. And of course, Spotify hated it, and they said, no, we're not going to live with this, it's going to put us out of business. And they're doing exactly the same thing in Canada at the moment. Canada's imposing a 5% levy, and Spotify's, it's actually the major record labels in Canada, they're saying, no, we can't live with this. Personally, I think it shouldn't be solely the responsibility of government. I think streaming platforms and labels are making so much money that they should have a role to play in funding niche artists.
And maybe to add on to that, I think an important role is also to play for just general interest groups such as yours, but also here in Belgium. There's a few interest groups that try to bring musicians together because, you know, as it's a bit of a cheesy saying, but it's kind of true. If you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. And it's true. It's true. So it's typically musicians are so diverse. If you ask a punk rock band to speak with a baroque viola da gamba player, they're likely going to get along because they're both very nice people, always. But they have such different lives. And if you go throughout the entire spectrum of musicians, They're all so different. I, myself, I'm a classical musician. I also like, obviously, I don't want to repeat Taylor Swift, but I will. So there's a diversity in musical tastes. But to bring all of that diversity into one voice, super hard. So traditionally, it's been very hard to bring musicians together. And the people from the Muziekgilde here in Belgium, they often have this difficulty too, like to bring musicians together, to make them feel heard. Musicians do need to come together. So these interest groups have a very important role to play, but musicians need to come and use those possibilities to get that voice and to get the seat at the table, to thereby influence policy and make a difference in the long run.
All right. Should we take some questions from the audience at this point? I hope you have some. I'm going to... Oh, we have the gentleman in the person that I can't really see. So the person in the cap. If
Oh, sorry. Who had a question?
the person in the cap there, can you want to put your hand up? Just there, in the light-coloured cap. No? Yes, just yeah.
No.
Yeah, that person in the cap.
No question.
No? Oh, no. You were just waving to be friendly. You know Liz or something. Okay. All right. Okay, someone else who does have a question. Otherwise, I'm going to have to think of one. So one at the back, and then we'll come to you in a moment.
So thanks a lot, and thanks for this debate. I'm Mark. I'm working for EXA, the European Composer and Songwriter Alliance. I bought both the books of Joséphine and Liz. I still need to read them, but I just wanted to I mean,
Liz's book is very readable. I mean, no.
I'm a lawyer, Simon, so I can read both, I guess.
Okay, all right, okay.
But no, I just wanted to say that I think we need to look, and that's what Joséphine was saying, that the first link between an author or a performer, composer, musician, with his music, with the exploitation of his music, is the contract. So it's very important that that the work of Joséphine is doing about contracts, and that we are trying to, I hate this word, but to educate also composers, musicians about the importance of the contract and their first contract, what they are, giving up as rights and what they get in exchange. So I think here we can probably work together with associations like us, representing composers and writers, on trying to make sure, and it's hard, it's copyright law, it's dense, but trying to understand what authors and performers are giving in exchange of their rights.
I'm going to do that thing when I say I don't hear a question.
Yeah, so I have a question for Liz. To which extent, because of course there is this rule about the pro rata system, there is also one rule about the 30-second threshold. That basically, you get only one stream and only one after 30 seconds, even if your song is, 7-8 minutes long. So, can you maybe tell us to which extent it did impact, music making? Thank you.
Yeah, well, also just to elaborate on what you're saying about contracts, something that I don't think I write about in the book, but this group that I spend a lot of time writing about, United Musicians and Allied Workers, one of the projects that they worked on early in their existence as an organization that I feel like would be really helpful for other musicians, organizations, and solidarity groups to replicate is they have a section on their website where they got musicians to submit their redacted contracts, just like through a Google form, and they made them available to their membership. So if you're a young band or an artist signing a contract with a company for the first time, you could check out other people's contracts to see what other people are dealing with or what other terms others are getting, and that type of information sharing, it reminds me, I'm a freelance writer, and there's this organization in New York called the Freelance Solidarity Project, and one of their big things is like they created this rate sharing database for freelancers, and that kind of information sharing amongst independent musicians I think is really helpful. And then in terms of the other part of your question with the influence or the impact of the like monetization after 30 seconds, yeah, I think that's had a big impact on like, you know, just the idea of maybe even more so than like the 30-second mark, but the idea of like replay value being the thing that determines the value of a song or a piece of music in the streaming era, like gets to the heart of, I think, so many of the ways in which certain types of musicians get left behind by this model. You know, if you're thinking about like people who make classical or jazz or like, I don't know, like or noise music, experimental music, ambient music that is released in long tracks. You know, so many artists in instrumental music will make records where it's like side A and side B. Like, you know, that doesn't work in the streaming era.
And it affects also the classical music industry in the way that albums are put online now. So, for example, if you listen to a symphony of Gustav Mahler, which is an hour and a half long, in principle 4 movements, but now they put it into tiny little bits. So every time the tempo changes, it's a new song. And it's because of that 30-second rule, right? Because otherwise you'd only have 4 streams in total for the entirety of the Auferstehung Symphony. And now you have like, well, it's still only 14 or something. But, you know, it's over. Yeah, it's multiplied by 4 almost. So it's a specific effect that is very clear, and also the length of music. If you listen to the radio, I think it was today that I heard the new single of Ancienne. I think it's 1 minute 17 seconds.
The entire thing.
And they're like, it's new music. It's very short, but it's new and we like it. Yeah, because she knows she can get the value for much less seconds of music as well. It's a good song. I'm not going to lie about that. It's a very good song, but it's very short, and there's a reason for that, I think.
I even heard like indie rock musicians telling me that their labels will turn their record in, and their label will be like, why don't you consider cutting this like ambient intro off the first track because that track is too long, it's not going to stream well, like that sort of thing. And to me it's just sort of like, wow, what are independent labels even for, if like even independent record labels are saying this kind of thing or suggesting people cut up their tracks into like shorter things for more streams.
And it's also with the featured artists, they come much earlier in the song, right? So if you had a featured artist 15 years ago, you'd go until like the second verse, and then right in front of the chorus, bam, the famous person would step in. No, it's now start, famous person. Because what you need is the hook. In TikTok, it's only even 10 seconds, and then it's enough. You need the famous person, people listen, for 30 seconds, you've got your stream. So that even affects the structure of music that is available on Spotify.
So to come back to the question, that's the title of the event, is Spotify changing the way that we listen to music? Is it changing the way we listen to music, or do our habits persist despite what the streaming platforms would like us to do?
I think there's many different answers.
Because we were talking before backstage about, well, particularly your attachment to albums and listening to whole albums. And I wonder if there isn't kind of a sort of, you know, a deep memory or a deep attachment to the way that we listen to music that isn't being changed. Although I suppose the commercial data would suggest otherwise. So actually the habits maybe aren't changing, but the money is going elsewhere.
Yeah, one of the things that we said was streaming should have a warning label on it, do not stream to excess. Because I think streaming is great as long as you behave yourself with it. If you can control yourself so that you pick your favorite album and then you listen to the album, you don't skip it. So I think there's so much to be said for sitting down and listening to an album through some really good headphones or through a really good stereo with no distractions and listening to it like you might watch a film or something. And so streaming's brilliant for that because you can pick your album. But as Liz's book points out, it's very difficult to when you're faced against big tech kind of pushing you not to do that, you have to have the self-control to sit down and say, I'm listening to the album, I'm not going to be affected by other stuff.
Mm-hmm. And then there's also like the material reality that if you are a fan of an album and you pay $7 for it on Bandcamp, that $7 is actually going to be deposited into the bank account of that artist within a couple of days. And I do think that, I do think there's sort of like a deeper attachment that people have with music when they have their own collection of it. But, that said, I think the question of the talk, is Spotify changing music? Like, even as someone who wrote a whole book about Spotify, like, I always like to reiterate that I think of Spotify as like an entryway into a story that does not start or end with one company. And I'd say that, like, I think the current state of the music industry, the current types of incentives that are being shaped by streaming companies in partnership with their major label partners, like, I think these things are shaping different types of relationships with music, are influencing listeners and artists in certain ways. But I think that Spotify is kind of just like one entry point into unpacking those bigger, like, systemic shifts.
Do you think that people's attachment to albums and listening in a way people listened before the streaming era, whether that survives? Because at times I think we're like with big tech now in general, not least because of even until their involvement in the Trump, I hate to say administration because it's not the right word for what's going on, but the the whatever you want to call it over there, but there is a backlash against big tech now, and there's the whole enshittification theory, which Cory Doctorow has written about. But it's kind of people are people not turning their backs on the sort of habits that the streaming platforms and other big tech want us to have, and actually looking for other models of engagement. I was going to say consumption, but it's such a horrible word. But engagement and community-based activities and that kind of thing. Do you see grounds for optimism? Or
I think so. I mean, it kind of comes back to the question that was asked earlier about, like, do we have empirical data that people's music habits have changed? I think there actually is like a research institute in the UK somewhere that is currently undertaking a project right now to actually research that question. I meant to say, I don't know off the top of my head which university it is, but there is some sort of work to put like hard data to that. There is stuff like in the UK also, there's been like a musician census. There are sort of some of these like attempts to sort of actually get information about how streaming is changing music for artists. Maybe one day we'll have similar data like that when it comes to listeners as well. But from my perspective, like looking at the vision that streaming services like put forward about how they would like to shape music, and then looking around, and I think in a lot of ways the unpacking of the impacts of streaming on listening is sort of anecdotal in some ways. But I see it like all the time. Even people that I know who I would consider to be dedicated listeners of music, who care a lot about independent artists, will send me a screenshot of their day list as if they think it's the first time anyone's ever sent me a screenshot of their day list and been like, look how funny this is. And I'm like, oh my God, even you are listening to day list? And I worry a little bit about these more kind of like things that might seem lower stakes, like, someone who is a fan of music or considers themselves to be a curious listener, but opens the streaming app and sees a daily mix and is like, oh, well, this is mostly stuff I listen to, so like I know that this isn't like the most intentional way to listen to music, but I'm just gonna like throw on this daily mix. And then all of a sudden you're like listening to a playlist that is impacted by discovery mode, and like you're listening to a bunch of music that is being recommended to you because of commercial deals that are in place, asking artists to accept a 30% royalty reduction in exchange for algorithmic promotion. And to me, it's kind of those like subtle changes that are being influenced because of the, utter convenience and frictionlessness of it all, that I kind of like worry about a little bit more than, I don't think that people who care about music are all of a sudden going to start listening to generative AI music like next year and be okay with it. Like, I don't think that's going to happen. I think that there are these kind of ways in which the ways people receive music, the way music is contextualized, the way that like the purpose of what music is for shaped by these systems is a little bit more kind of like what I think is at stake.
I think we had
before we go to the next question, Josephine, I love your book. It's extremely readable. Just so you know.
We had a question. I'm going to try and sort of do the order that people put their hands up. I didn't say I didn't like the book. I didn't say I didn't like it.
I'm excited to read it.
I really liked it. And I said to Josephine before, it was...
Fine.
And I even praised the structure, didn't I? And you agreed that the structure was intentional. Because basically, if you read that I only read the chapter, but if you read that, because copyright is such a complicated subject, and it's so complicated, and it's so complicated in the EU context where there's different countries still retain different copyright systems to a large extent. That if you read that chapter, then it's a fantastic education into the whole world of music contract law.
Don't worry. The best bits, as usual in a PhD, is the acknowledgement section, which I worked very long and very hard on.
Okay, so we did have a question here.
Yeah. So I'm an independent artist in the lo-fi music scene and ambient music scene. So what's currently being labeled as background music and passive listening music by Spotify. I've worked with mainly all the biggest labels in that genre, Lo-Fi Girl, Sleep Tales, and all these labels have big playlists on Spotify that are being followed by a bunch of people. And we've heard stories of Spotify de-promoting those playlists in favor of their own. That's currently being replaced by AI and fake artist music. So I'm curious how you guys see the future for artists that are producing background music.
That's one for Liz, if ever I heard one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you'd be the expert on this question, honestly, as someone who is in that industry. But I was just thinking about that earlier today. Like, I think it is interesting how there's simultaneously so much, what a former Spotify employee would call like consumption. There's so much consumption on those playlists, but there's so little so few examples of it translating to people kind of like clicking on the artist profiles, like following the artist, becoming fans of the artists. And in some ways, like the section of my book that is about lo-fi hip-hop beats was one of my favorite sections to report, because it was truly something that I didn't know that much about and had to go track down lo-fi hip-hop beat producers and convince them to speak with me. And because they're so anonymous online, it could be really hard to track down who actually are the people behind these producer monikers. But learning about the sort of trajectory of that scene and how in the early 2010s, when lo-fi hip-hop, the sort of maybe you'd call it third wave lo-fi hip-hop or something, I'm not sure, but the 2010s version of it was sort of that community and scene was coming together online, that it wasn't necessarily immediately this kind of study beat oriented thing, but it was more kind of SoundCloud and Bandcamp based before streaming. Sort of, I talk about musacking as a verb in the book, as something that happens to different genres. It's not like people set out to make neo-musac. It's that the systems of recommendation and the playlistification seems to sort of smooth out the rough edges a lot of these scenes. But something I was just thinking about today is would there be kind of an appetite for a way of interfacing with this type of music that put more emphasis on who the people making the music are? And a curiosity to me is why more people in that music scene don't put forth other ways of discovering and contextualizing that music. But like, are there any music writers who cover like the lo-fi beat space, that kind of thing? I'm not sure. Are there any like, NTS or like community radio shows dedicated to that kind of music? Like,
yeah, there are some, but I think that it's mostly the labels that are doing this kind of music, that are taking control and creating a kind of community around the artists that are signed to these labels. But yeah, I think it's pretty rare that you encounter a journalist that's specified in lo-fi hip-hop beats. I think you would encounter that more frequently with ambient music, because that's the thing that you could also see in festivals, compared with lo-fi hip-hop that's purely streaming, I would say. But yeah, I think that there is a movement of labels taking control of the community aspect of things, yeah.
Okay. We don't have time for a lot more questions. I'm just looking at Joyce. One more, Joyce is saying to me. So one more. Who was next? You had a question, so let's...
I have two, so...
Okay.
No, actually, I think it's already answered.
Could you do it? Oh, okay, all right.
I was just thinking of, you mentioned Bandcamp, and I was just thinking, because they are really like good. I mean, I try to use as much as possible instead of Spotify. Aren't they? Isn't there some path for an alternative that they have a streaming option as well? But I don't know. You're obviously not the CEO of Bandcamp, but have you heard of this idea?
It's super interesting. As someone who, like, my own listening is way more wrapped up in Bandcamp, I sometimes joke that like Bandcamp is the corporate digital enclosure that like I am stuck inside of, like, not even really streaming. And there's so much currently. There are so many people right now working on Bandcamp alternatives, because Bandcamp is, financially makes so much more sense. Like, it is like the best we have in terms of like a platform where you can directly support independent artists, but also it's a tech company that like, has a lot of the same concerns as other tech companies. There's like union busting. They fired a bunch of the people who were involved in Bandcamp United a couple of years ago. That really eroded some of the goodwill in the independent music community. It got bought by Epic Games. It got sold by Epic Games to Songtrader. I think a lot of people in independent music are sort of like confused about Bandcamp currently as like a company, and especially with like mid-level and smaller independent labels. In some cases, like Bandcamp could be, where even more of their revenue comes from than from streaming. So in some ways, it's even more consequential. So right now, like off the top of my head, could think of like 5 different instances of musician-led efforts to create like alternatives to Bandcamp. There's a few different like cooperative alternatives to Bandcamp that are brewing right now that are like kind of interesting, but all really early on in their projects.
But I wasn't asking for an alternative for Bandcamp. I was thinking, is Bandcamp a possible leader in fighting Spotify in this?
Yeah, I mean, I think they are, like, in some ways it kind of feels like there's like 2 different music ecosystems that exist, like especially in independent music. Like there's been a lot of goodwill around Bandcamp the past 5-10 years as like the alternative. There's an article in NPR. I started out talking about Damon Kurkowski, who shouted out one of his articles. I'll shout out another one. He wrote this article called like A Tale of 2 Music Ecosystems, and it was about like Spotify and Bandcamp kind of like juxtaposing them. That was from like 3 or 4 years ago, and I thought it did a good job sort of laying out, these kind of like 2 parallel economies that kind of exist. But a lot of the bigger independent labels, I think, aren't super excited about Bandcamp because they don't pay for the streams. But I think most independent artists like aren't super concerned about like the 3 or 4 streams that someone might get on a track before they're prompted to pay for it.
Maybe in addition to Bandcamp, I'm quite a big fan of Deezer, not only because of their championing of the user-centric payment system, but also in view of the AI thing, let's call it the thing at the moment, because Deezer have developed technology to check whether a certain song is AI generated, and they kick it out of the platform. And that's good, because Spotify doesn't do it. at least not to that extent. And Spotify has, again, those vested interests, has the vested interest in making its own AI-generated content, plugging it on playlists, as you were saying before, thereby keeping more than the 30% that they've allocated themselves on the basis of contracts. So a big player like Deezer, which is already a streaming service, which has fairness much more in mind, or so at least it would seem, maybe also a challenger to the Spotify throne.
Okay, great. I think we have to bring things to an end. So thanks so much to Liz for talking about her really great book. I'm told it's available. You can order it from Passaporta and probably other online bookshops, but certainly from Passaporta, which is a local bookshop here.
There's also a French version in the works.
Ah, okay.
My literary agents had to say that.
Ah, very good. Not machine translated, I hope.
No.
No. Good. I can only thank you, Josephine. I can only recommend your book. If you read both books, you're completely equipped for the digital age. Nick, do you have any books in the offing that you want to plug?
Record.
Or maybe a nice position paper?
No, thank you.
Okay, very good. Thanks to our speakers, but most of all, thanks to you, the audience, for coming tonight. Thanks for making it out and not choosing to sit on a terrace with a nice cold beer, although it's Belgium, so you can still do that for at least the next 6 hours or something like that. And thank you to AB for having the idea of this event. I actually saw it and bought a ticket for it and then managed to force my way onto the stage. It's a bit of a dream come true to be able to do this. I was in this room on Sunday night watching Annika. I don't know if anyone else was here. It was... no, you're all shaking your heads. She's under 30. I can assure you, and she's great, so I recommend. The music sounds like 1979 era post-punk, but that's a good thing, I think. It certainly is for me. So thanks once again. Thanks to everyone at AB, the backstage staff. Just a little personal promotion. Tonight is being recorded and will be launched as a podcast in the next week or so on the New Books Network. I will share it when it's done. I will share a link so that you can, if you want to listen to it or share it with your friends who weren't able to come tonight, you'll be able to do that.
Thank you so much.